Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today's question comes to us straight out of the Judge Vault, and it's an extremely important situation to be familiar with because it's a very common occurrence across all levels of play and across all formats. Amy controls Dragon's Rage Channeler, and she plays Expressive Iteration. After Nick says that it resolves, she picks up the top 3 cards of her library, but then she raises her hand and calls for a judge. As you get to the table, Amy tells you that she forgot to surveil with her Dragon's Rage Channeler, and she wants to be able to do so. What is the appropriate infraction, penalty, and fix? Okay, let's first take a look at Dragon's Rage Channeler, and notice that it uses the word whenever with this ability. This indicates that this is a triggered ability, and because Amy has missed this triggered ability, the appropriate infraction is missed trigger. Nick has not committed an infraction, because it is not against the rules to allow your opponent to miss a triggered ability that they control. Even if it was, Nick didn't actually have any opportunity to call for a judge himself between the time when he saw Amy commit this infraction and when Amy herself called a judge. So Nick has committed no infraction and fulfilled all his obligations as a tournament player here. Now let's take a look at what the appropriate penalty to assess Amy for this infraction is. Notice that it's not really possible for a player to gain an advantage from not surveilling in this situation here. They could always just look at the top card and choose to keep it on top. So with that being the case, it does make sense that this triggered ability is not considered detrimental for Amy, and therefore the default would be that she would get no penalty for this infraction. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the fix. And with the fix, because this was caught right away, this missed trigger has the potential to either be put on the stack right now or missed entirely. The choice would be given to Amy's opponent, that is, Nick. So that's the ruling that I would issue if this situation was to happen at competitive rules enforcement level. Now let's take a look at what might change if the same situation was to occur at regular rules enforcement level. Now here, we're not going to be looking at the infraction procedure guide as our guiding document. We're going to instead be looking at the Judging at Regular Rel document, which of course governs regular rules enforcement level events. And in this document, missing a triggered ability is cited as a common problem. And so we have some specific guidance about how they recommend that we deal with this common problem. There's 2 specific things that I want to look at. One of them would be for triggered abilities that include the word may, in which case we can just assume the player chose not to do whatever the instruction is. Unfortunately, Dragon's Rage Channeler does not actually use the word may in its triggered ability, nor does that word appear in the comprehensive rules definition for what surveil means. And so that means that that line of guidance isn't really applicable to this situation. So for all other triggered abilities, it says that the judge can put that triggered ability on the stack at this point as at their discretion. And so that's exactly what I would do. Now, because we are judging at regular rules enforcement level here, we do have a little bit of latitude to kind of modify the fix a little bit to suit our taste or maybe improve things a little bit. And so I'd like to talk about a couple of common modifications that I think people might be considering. First of all, a lot of people have stores where people are a little bit more competitive and they expect their opponents to be playing a little bit more cleanly. In a situation like that, it might be appropriate to mirror the fix that we had at competitive rules enforcement level, where rather than the judge using their own discretion to put this triggered ability on the stack, the judge would offer the player's opponent that opportunity instead. And so I could definitely see this sort of thing coming up if you knew that the players involved had a little bit more experience or were more competitively mindset oriented. Another thing that I think a lot of people might try to do to modify this fix would be maybe instead of putting the triggered ability on the stack right now, which based on the way that it's worded in the IPG and also in the Judging at Rules Enforcement level document, it would be put onto the stack. And that means that we would finish resolving the expressive iteration in both those cases, and only after that expressive iteration has finished would you proceed to the surveil trigger. And so that's the wording that both the IPG and the Judging at Regular Rel document give for what you're supposed to do. Maybe a modification that we could do would be, instead of doing that, we might back up so that we get to do the scry first and then resolve the expressive iteration. And that's an okay idea to think about, but I'm not really sure if I would be on board with that. So the reason would be, what are we going to do with those 3 cards that Amy saw? Are we going to put them back on top of her library and then have her surveil one of them? In that case, we would have to trust Amy to put them back in the right order, and maybe she would or maybe she wouldn't, but it certainly would be tempting to put them back in a different order and get rid of the top worst card. On the other hand, if we were to shuffle those cards back into Amy's library and then have her look at 3 new ones when the new expressive iteration happens, well, that's got its own kind of integrity issues, where if Amy didn't like her top 3 cards, she might be incentivized to strategically remember that missed trigger and therefore have a shot at getting 3 new cards with her expressive iteration. In general, I don't like fixes that give a potential for abuse like this to the offending player, and so that's the reason why I would probably stick with what's given in the policy documents, where we would just do the surveil a little bit after the expressive iteration is resolved instead of trying to back up and do it before the expressive iteration resolves, even though that would technically be the time when Amy is supposed to be doing the surveil if everything happened with no infractions. All right. So with all of that being the case, those are the rulings that I would issue if I saw this situation happen at both competitive and regular rules enforcement level. However, there is still one kind of interesting point that I sort of glossed over when I was talking about this originally, and that would be this line in the Magic tournament rules, which indicates that if a player is instructed to surveil and then they don't, then we can interpret that as meaning that the player chose to surveil and looked at the top card and chose to keep it on top of their library. So what are we to make of this? Does that mean that the appropriate infraction, penalty, and fix in both those cases should actually have been that the player just doesn't get to surveil at all and they get no infraction and are told to continue playing? And that certainly is what this sort of seems like it's telling us. However, we need to be really careful about how we apply this policy. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we would decide which of these 2 policies that seem to have governance over the situation we should use. So obviously, it's not possible for both of these 2 policies to apply at the same time. We need to use one of them or the other to make our ruling. And so which one should we use? To answer that question, we need to answer one very important point. If you notice, these 2 policies seem to cover the exact same situation, but it turns out there's a very subtle difference in between them. And that would be whether Amy was actually instructed to surveil. So if you believe that Amy knew that she was supposed to surveil and chose not to for some reason, then that would mean that the tournament shortcut interpretation is what you would want to use to base your ruling off of. On the other hand, if you believe that Amy forgot about the triggered ability or didn't have that triggered ability on the stack for some other reason and only realized that after she started to resolve her expressive iteration, well, that would mean that the triggered ability she missed was never on the stack and it never resolved. And so that would mean that Amy actually never was instructed to surveil. So, which of these 2 interpretations do we think is the most likely to correspond to the facts of the actual case? And based on the situation that I presented in the original problem statement, I think that it's very clear that the missed trigger interpretation is the one that most closely corresponds to what actually happened. We have some evidence for this in the form of the fact that Amy specifically called a judge on herself, and also that Amy said that she forgot about the triggered ability from the Dragon Rage channeler that allowed her to surveil. Based on those facts, I think the interpretation that Amy missed her trigger is much stronger than the other one. That's not to say that some different facts of the case couldn't come up in a different ruling where I would lean the other way. For example, if Amy already knew the top card of her library, say for example from a previous surveil, or maybe she's able to look at the top card of her library in some other way, well, in that case, I would think that the tournament shortcut interpretation would be a lot stronger, and I would be more inclined to rule that Amy had just chosen not to surveil and she shouldn't get to surveil now. Again, that's based on the specific facts of the case and your interpretation of exactly what happened. So that's the things that I would be thinking about in making that determination. So some of you might be wondering, well, if that's so, then what is the real purpose for that tournament shortcut? And I already gave you one idea, which is that if a player already knew the top card of their library, it's pretty likely that they would choose not to surveil again if they got another instruction to surveil and they already knew that they wanted to keep it on top. However, to get the full picture, I think that it's important to have a little bit of history on the background of exactly how this tournament shortcut came to be. So back in 5th Dawn, Magic introduced the scry mechanic for the first time. And at that point, it was only intended to just be a normal mechanic that shows up for one block, and then afterwards we go to a different set and we don't have that mechanic anymore. So at the time when scry was first introduced, it was brand new, it was exciting, and all of the cards that were introduced had scry too. And a lot of the time, that meant that based on the way the cards were costed, it really didn't make a whole lot of sense for you to forget to scry, because that was such a major part of the effects that the spell had. Later, they brought the scry mechanic back in the time spiral block. And when they did that, almost all of the cards that they printed had some sort of mechanical connection in between what the rest of the card's effect was and what the scry did. So maybe you would reveal the top card of your library after you scried, and that would deal damage based on the mana cost that you revealed. Something like that. And again, this made it really difficult for players to forget to scry, because, of course, since it's mechanically connected to the stuff that the card is doing, then it makes it a lot less likely that you're going to just not do that part. And so finally, the next time they brought the scry mechanic back is where they had the real problems. In the Theros block, they printed a lot of scry cards where the scry was basically just stapled on to the rest of what the card did. And it was very likely that you would be playing the card with some other motive in mind and completely forget about the fact that you were allowed to scry one. Here's the problem though. If you have a game instruction that instructs you to do something and you forget to perform that game instruction, well, that would be a case of a game rule violation. If you had a triggered ability that was telling you to scry, well, then maybe you could consider that to be a missed trigger. But if you had a game instruction from a resolving instant or sorcery spell that was telling you to scry, that's a completely different story. And with that being the case, there were a lot of people getting game rule violations because they forgot to scry. Now, nobody thought that that was a good idea. After all, there's no way you could cheat by not looking at the top card of your library and leaving it on top. So that was the impetus behind why we wanted this shortcut. Now we have an official shortcut in the Magic Tournament rules that we can point to that says if you forgot to scry, that's okay. It doesn't mean that you didn't perform a game instruction. And so that means you didn't technically commit a game rule violation. I think that was a pretty great hack, and it made it so that that entire problem completely went away. Of course, when the similar Surveil mechanic was introduced years later, we expanded that shortcut to also apply to it, because of course, they're so mechanically similar, and the same logic really does apply. But that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling. But until then, I hope you have a great day.